냥제 전부做的明明用做那么能进步俺叫的把个大人工都学嘛东巴特别讲了基本上那些是我在那已经公司人家或者基本了一烂里面帮助着了说了 The
unsurpassed, profound, and wonderful Dharma is difficulty encountering billions of aeons. I now see it here to receive and uphold it, vow to fathom the Buddha's true meaning, to liberate all beings, thus generate the supreme bodhicitta. So we have already studied the non-Buddhist schools, which then includes both of the brief explanation and then the extensive explanation. We have already started on the extensive explanation and covered a few of the other non-Buddhist schools. Currently, we're talking about the fifth categories, which then includes 11 categories of non-Buddhist schools. This part also includes 3 aspects: the brief explanation, the extensive explanation, and then the summary. Let's look at the brief explanation. It says that there are 11 categories, 360, that then has been divided by the categories of the past, present, and future moments. Within these 11 categories, there are 362 schools of philosophies, which then can also be divided into 2 parts, the ones that holds on to the past and then the ones that holds on to the future moments. There are 18 that's associated to the past and 44 associated to the future. Now let's look at the extensive explanation of all of them. All of the 11, that is, Mipa Rinpoche's textual outline is indeed quite excellent. Over here it says that there are the 10 that corresponds to the names of Buddhist terms or Buddhist schools, and then 9 that holds on to permanence, 6 types of crooked views, and the 7 dhyanas, the 6 darshanas, the 6 ministers, the 4 types of affiliated teachings, the 6 kinds of philosophies. 4 views depends on causes, and the 2 philosophers, as well as the secretive activities. These are the 11 categories. So over here it states the 11 types. Altogether 11 categories. We will further elaborate upon them in the later part. Let's just briefly take a look at them. It would be a brief introduction today. I think it can be helpful. Previously, we had already covered the 300 types of heretics teachings, out of which there are 18 types affiliated with the previous moments and 44 types affiliated with the latter. Let's look at the first category, which talks about the school of philosophy that shares the similar names. This first category has 10, includes 10, which are the 10 schools that has the teachings that's very much affiliated or very much similar to the Buddhist teachings. For example, we have the Shravakayana, then for the same types of teachings, they call it as the conventional. And then when it comes to the Pratika Buddhayana, they have the same school, and when it comes to the the mind-only school, they would call it the school of subtlety, and the ones of Madhyamika, they call it great subtlety, and the previous ones are the schools that belongs to the Sutrayana. In the Vajrayana, they also have different names. They have the different names to the Kriya Tantra Yana, and then the Charya Tantra, as well as the Yoga Tantra. When it comes to the Mother Tantras, they would call it, when it comes to the father tantras, they call it the great disdained actions school, and then when it comes to the mother tantra yana teachings, they would call it as the contemplation schools. And when it comes to the non-dual tantra, they would call it as the victory yana or victory school. So altogether there are 10. They simply would change the names of the different yanas and not changing the teachings, and they would call it as their own school of philosophy or their own religion. Lots of the Qigong and yoga teachers, they would renown themselves as they would proclaim that they are the creator of so-and-so school. But after a period of time, we would be able to see that there are so many different names and different categories of the belief and schools. However, they are simply taking the names of the others. Now, the second category refers to the 9 types of schools that believes in permanence. They would believe in something that is permanent. For example, they would believe that the Mahashvara is permanent, is constant. Or some would say that the verses, the shlokas of Veda is permanent. Some would say that the self that is undescribable is permanent. So 2 different schools, they would agree that there is something that is constantly existent. They would agree, or they would proclaim that the merit would be constant. The Atman would be constant, or Purusha would be constant, some of which would be considered as part of the Samkhya or the Vaisheshika philosophical schools. There are all kinds of schools and all kinds of teachings and studies in this world. In order to divide them into categories, there are a variety of categories. But sometimes when we categorize them, when we look at the ones that talks about constants or permanence, we would say that which of the school would say that would persist on certain aspects of them being constant. And I think it's important for us to differentiate ourselves with the ones that would hold on to some kinds of permanent existence. For example, we would proclaim that the Tadakatagarbha is of constancy, and our nature is permanent, our awareness is constant. If we were to say that, how is that different than the heretics' teachings? We had already studied that and talked about it. So we would speak of constants, of permanence and constant existence, but the nature of such permanence is not parted from the 3 liberation gates. So that is to say, the nature is empty. But the heretics, the teachings, the non-Buddhist students who would say that whatever is considered as permanent is not empty. So there are lots of differences, still subtle differences. And then the third aspect is the 6 types of crooked teachings, where they would say that, the causes for practice is not valid. And for example, in the Vedic school, they would talk about the self is existent, and for such reasons, one can experience happiness and suffering. Also, on top of that, there are other schools, including the schools that focus on the action, the Vedic school, and different schools would consider that the sound is constant. Why is that? It is because it is unconditioned. The next one is the Digambara school. They would consider that even the trees and vegetations have life, because at the time of being peeled, some of the vegetations would die. So they would consider that the vegetations are also sentient. But according to the sutras such as Shurangama Sutra and so on, these Sutra simply stated that that's the collective conditions that formed the result as such, but there is no sentient life associated to the vegetations because they're not they're not compressed of the 5 aggregates. We need to understand that. The next one is the Samkhya school. Some of the Samkhya schools would consider that the materialistic things also have life, which is similar to the previous school because the previous Digambara school, they would use reasons that seems to be rather vague and saying that after vegetables being peeled, they would die, and then they would argue that those kinds of vegetations also are sentient. The next one is the Vaisheshika school. They proclaim that since at the time of being living, it is associated to body, and at the time of death, since the body will perish, the self-grasping would cease as well. So that's their particular belief. The next one is the Dhyana school, such as the Charvaka belief or Charvaka philosophy, which belongs to the Lokayata school of philosophy. They would consider that practice, even on a conventional level, is invalid. Don't even mention about the ultimate level. The next one talks about the Dhyana school. Part of the Dhyana school is called the school of the sun, where the practice is to practice upon the without any objects, because they would consider that 6 consciousness and 6 objects are all defiled, so they would practice with the undefiled, non-dualistic object, which is without object. We could see that some of the so-called heretics or the non-Buddhist schools, their practices are rather still quite advanced, and they practice quite diligently with a great deal of ascetic practices, lots of hardship. And then the next one is the Vaisheshika. The Vaisheshikas would consider that all thoughts are faulty. All of those dualistic and conceptual thoughts are contaminated. According to the 6th Patriarch of the Sutra, it states that there was once a meditator whose name is Wolun, who could eradicate hundreds of kinds of conceptual thoughts and not generating any minds to objects, and thinking that would be the only way to generate bodhi. And Master Huineng then stated to him that this is not the appropriate way of engaging in practice. And then he also gave some teachings on how to engage in correct practice. According to Beacon of Certainty, it states that the school that upholds the philosophy, one should not generate any conceptual thoughts at the time of meditation, is not necessarily the highest teaching. It is not considered as the correct way of practice. If, for example, some of the Zen practitioners and the Zen school would say that one should not be distracted and not generating any thoughts. May seems to be a high level of practice, but this is also discussed in the Vedic schools, where they would say that all of the suffering, happiness, and dualistic thoughts should be abandoned, and one should practice just like the space. That may seems to be the highest level of practice, and similar to the Prajna school of philosophy. However, their stress is that only by looking at the space-like nature, and that space-like is not necessarily the kinds of practice similar to Vipassana. The 6th one, the next one talks about the 6 nihilistic schools. and then the 6 ministers, and so on. At that time in India, there were the 2 philosophers that's very well known. One is of the eternalism, and the other one nihilism. Altogether, with the Vedic school and then the nihilistic and eternalism and the secretive actions, altogether there are 362 views. According to Master Kuiji in his Yogacara Shastra, he stated that there are 16 categories of non-Buddhist schools. Over here, we're talking about 11 categories. Of course, there are different ways of making those categories. In Chinese Buddhism, the mainland Buddhism, unlike the Tibetan Buddhism, which had been influenced more so in the Indian philosophy, where led us to study more of the non-Buddhist schools and how to refute the non-Buddhist schools, especially when it comes to the middle way teachings, when it comes to the familiar teachings such as the 400 verses, the valid cognition, the ornament of Madhyamika, the Madhyamika Avatara, and Madhyamika Karika, and so on. We study a lot of the non-Buddhist schools. And these kinds of studies are quite important because we often would see the non-Buddhist practitioners. And I think we can say that many of our fellow Sangha members, before you entered into the gates of Buddhism, you practiced the yogas and the qigong and breathing and meditation and so on and so forth. Even if you were to be born as a Buddhist in this lifetime, it is hard to say if you were a Buddhist before, you were probably a non-Buddhist practitioner. Even you might be a creator of other non-Buddhist philosophies in your past lifetime. Nowadays, there are all kinds of methods, all kinds of ways, all kinds of theories and doctrines that proclaim different kinds of methods that would lead to happiness. But before we actually engage in study of the various philosophies, we would not be able to differentiate the subtleties. And on top of that, since many of us studied the non-Buddhist philosophies, we also probably was born as non-Buddhist practitioners in our lifetime. We would carry those habitual tendencies into our studies of Buddhism. And some of you probably don't even feel very familiar with the Buddhist teachings. Not only that, you might be appalled with the Buddhist teachings. That definitely shows your habitual tendency of not being a Buddhist practitioner in the past. So the next one is a summary. In summary, there are eternalism and nihilism, and they talk about not coarse nor subtle. It is changing without true existence. How could there be eradication if it is not permanent? This verse summarizes the 360 or so wrong views or the non-Buddhist views, which could be included in our Sakkayaditthi views, the view of a self, a grasping of non-existent self. If we can refute the Sakkayaditthi, then all of the eternalism and nihilism can be refuted. How to refute eternalism and nihilism? It is rather very easy. First of all, we have to eradicate eternalism. And we can see that none of the phenomena can be eternally existent. We can look at the external phenomena, and and then make observation of the mind that observes the external phenomena. Let it be coarse or subtle, let it be forms or mind. In fact, none of those phenomena can be constantly abiding. If you make the observation with the smallest moment of time or the smallest unit of dust mote to observe the external or the object and the phenomena, then you would know that none of anything could be constantly abiding or eternally existing. In the ornaments of Madhyamika, it also talks about all kinds of methods we can make analysis, such as diamond splinter and so on. After making such observation, you will be able to see that there is no way for anything permanent to be established. If permanence cannot be established, then how could non-existence, how could complete void be existent? Why is that? It is because all phenomena are of causes and conditions. It is established because of causes and conditions. And causes and conditions cannot be permanent. If permanence cannot be established, then the non-permanence cannot be existent either. The non-permanence, such as the horns to the rabbits and the space, as well as the children of the barren woman. In our world, if you're interested, you can make observation of skandhas. Are you of one entity or of other entities with your skandha? When you make such observation, you will see that it cannot be established in either way. If we were to make observation with the fundamental wisdom of Madhyamika to observe our mind stream and the moment-to-moment changes of it, then we will see that it cannot be established. They are simply false. The so-called previous moment and later moment, as well as the thing itself, does it have any changes to it? If you can make the observation of it, what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that you would not be able to obtain anything that is permanent. If the permanence cannot be obtained, then of course the impermanence cannot be obtained. And that is to say that if permanence cannot be obtained, the nihilism and the void cannot be obtained. It is because they are relative to each other. So if we can eradicate all of them, then that eradicates the foundations of the wrong view. It is stated in the story in the miscellaneous Agama Sutra, once that the Buddha was in Raja Griha, and a non-Buddhist practitioner came to the Buddha saying that, is the Dharma constant or not? Is it permanent or not? And then he asked the Buddha 3 times, and the Buddha did not answer. Ananda got really curious, saying that, why don't you answer his questions? He asked you 3 times. And the Buddha said that if I were to answer his questions, he would then increase his wrong views. If I were to say that it is of constant, then he would get wild because he is full of wrong views already. He would think that he is correct. If I were to say that it is not existent, then he would fall into the extreme of a void, that he would be lost. I believe according to the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, it also states that if one were to say that all phenomena is without a self, such view is nihilistic. If one were to say that there is a self, that is the view of eternalism. If one were to say that there is a self associated to phenomena, then that is the view of eternalism. According to ornaments of Madhyamika, the further detailed analysis regarding coarse and subtle inference associated to eternalism and nihilism is expounded. And the next one, we're going to look at the 6 philosophies and the 5 schools. It also has both brief and extensive explanation. First of all, it's the brief. There are great numbers of the non-Buddhist schools, which includes Samkhya, Vaishesika, Digambara, Charvaka, and the practice of discrete. These are the 5 major schools. According to Gateway to Knowledge, also talks about these 5 schools. Though that there are great numbers of religions and beliefs, but they can be included all within these 5 particular schools. I believe back in 2020, at the time of doing the calculation of the numbers of different religions and schools within religions, there are about 42 or 4,300 religions. And within those religions, there are about tens of thousands of schools. For example, religion would be take Christianity as an example. So Christianity would be the religion, and then there are about tens of thousands of schools under that religion. Of the 7 billion of world population, about 86% of people claims to be religious, and about 2.3 billion are Christians, 1.9 billion are Muslims. And then it is stated that by 2050, the numbers of Muslims would surpass that of Christians. The numbers of religious believers to Islam has been increasing year by year, but the believers of Christianity decrease year by year, and the young people would not choose Christianity, it seems, but somehow attracted to Islam. Somehow they're quite interested into the very special actions and activities to the Islam belief. There were about 1 billion Hindus and 500 million people in the world believe in Buddhism, and about 10 million are Jewish. I think considering the Buddhism or Buddhists can be considered as the 4th out of the 5 major religions in this world. Compared to the numbers of other religious believers, we don't have that many, but compared to the smaller religious groups, we can be considered as a larger number or a major group of believers. It is also stated that the numbers of Buddhists had been increasing in the past few years. But even within Buddhism, we have lots of different schools. Lots of the schools, as well as religions outside of Buddhism, they can be of a great variety. In general, we can say that they are of Samkhya, of Vaishesika, of discrete action, of Digambara, and the 5th one is Lokayata. So the first 4 belong to the eternalist view, and then Lokayata school belongs to the nihilistic view. All of those teachings about the different non-Buddhist schools had been expounded quite clearly in the ornament of Madhyamika by Mipa Rinpoche. Now, over here, we are going to extensively discuss the 5 schools. These are explained quite extensively. So let's look at the first one, which is a Samkhya school. The Samkhya school claims that if one were to attain full understanding of the Purusa and Atman, as well as all the phenomena, and claims that they can attain realization and liberation, but those liberation are indeed false, because their nature, the self-nature, and their self-natures are of other entities, so they are quite contradictory to each other. It states that the Samkhyas that then believes the 25 truths. They believe that all of the knowable can be included within the 25 truths. So they would count those kinds of numbers, therefore it is called the Samkhya, the numbering school. And they would claim that there are the balance of the three virtues, as well as and they would call the Atman as a self, and they would say that there is the ultimate, and there is a Purusa and Atman, and then on top of that, 23 other kinds of phenomena are considered as the conventional, but the Purusa and Atman are considered as the ultimate. Those had been expounded quite clearly within the ornaments of Madhyamika and 400 verses. But over here, it mostly talks about all of those conventional phenomena can be merged into the self-nature, the Purusa and Atman, and then at that time one would be able to recognize one's nature. So the Purusa would manifest, and then oneself can attain liberation. Mipa Rinpoche stated that Atman is like Alaya and Purusa is like a consciousness. The nature of Alaya and consciousness, as well as all the conventional false manifestations at the time being merged into the Dharma Dhatu, then one can recognize the nature of mind. So out of all the non-Buddhist schools, the Samkhya is considered as quite of a higher level of non-Buddhist schools. It is in some ways similar to the Chittamatra school of Buddhism. Within the ornaments of Madhyamika, they stated lots of teachings like such, and included some of the teachings, included some of the descriptions of how Kapila, at the time of practicing in the snow mountains, he composed lots of books despite of the ascetic practices and hardships that he had to go through. And then after writing those books, he attained recognition and validation from his deity. There are lots of detailed explanations, but I am not going to expound too much of it. Some of the other non-Buddhist schools of philosophies was included in the Chinese Tripitaka, and I would give you just a brief introduction over here, and I hope you can read into the auto commentary and then finish reading the auto commentary before Monday. There is a section on the Vaishesika philosophy as well. After our class, I wish that you could arrange your time so that you can study that part by yourself. Over here, I would like to quote this story. Back in the South Song dynasty, there was once a master whose name is Fa Yun, Dharma Cloud. He compiled and edited some of the terminologies of Buddhism as well as stories. In his text, he included 2,040 entries. Out of all of those content, there was a story, and I think it's a story of the true history. The history happened about 800 years after the parinirvana of the Buddha. At that time, there was a Dharma teacher whose name was the wish-fulfilling gem, and he was very well known. He became the state master or the state advisor, and he would give Dharma teachings to both the king and the citizens. At the time of giving the Dharma teaching on the Four Noble Truths, he expounds it differently than that of the Buddha. He would expound it in a different order. He first would talk about accumulation and then suffering and then path and cessation, rather than the Buddha talked about suffering first, suffering and then the cause of suffering, which is accumulation, and then path and then cessation. And then some of the non-Buddhist schools started debating him by saying that the way he gives the teaching is not fitting to the Dharma teachings, and it is of his fault. He then explained by saying that, firstly, I would explain the accumulation of suffering, which is the cause for the fruition that is suffering, and then I would expound the cause for cessation, that is path, and then would talk about cessation, that is a fruition. After explaining it, the non-Buddhist schools debated him while gathering a large number of the non-Buddhist disciples. And the wish-fulfilling gem, the teacher, unfortunately lost to the debate, which resulted to the distrust from the king, and then he felt that the non-Buddhist school, the heretics, was giving the correct teaching, and then the king offered 70 bars of gold to the non-Buddhist, to the heretics teacher. And for such reason, the teaching of the heretics philosophy, that text, that karika, is called Savkya Karika, the 70 karikas. After about 100 years of this debate, Vasubandhu was born, and upon seeing the particular situation in the society, especially after the death and the loss of the debate of wish-fulfilling gem, he then composed a Shastra, particularly to refute the opinion of the non-Buddhist school. At that time, the original heretics teacher had already died. But Vasubandhu's teaching indeed could refute that of the heretics teacher, and Vasubandhu's particular refutation was praised by the king at that time. And then the king also offered him 70 bars of gold. So the Shastra that's composed by Vasubandhu is called that which triumphed Savkya Karika, the Shastra that gained victory over Savkya Karika. The original Savkya Karika had been translated by Paramata, and it is included in the Chinese Tripitaka. This is quite interesting and very rare, because within the Tripitaka there is this particular teaching that expounds the philosophy of the non-Buddhist schools. So Paramata translated this Savkya Karika, but not the one that's expounded by Vasubandhu, the Shastra that triumphs the Samkhya Karika. I think it would have been better if that one was translated, so that we can see how Vasubandhu debated with the previous opinions and philosophies. And because Vasubandhu won the debate after 100 years, so the body of the heretics, the teacher, got dug up again from the grave and got beaten up, and then the signs of fresh blood leaking from the body was shown to signify such a triumph. And then Vasubandhu said, specifically stated, as monastics, it is essential to understand the teachings of the Dharma as well as to understand the non-Dharmic schools, because without understanding it, it is not not appropriate. So as monastics, as practitioners, we do need to understand both the Buddhist teachings as well as non-Buddhist teachings, especially during this during this age of information. All of the information and teachings could be so easily to be obtained. If we were to study over here for a few years and then not understanding how to refute the opinions of the non-Buddhist schools, then it could make the non-Buddhist schools' opinion to be prosperous, and it's very difficult to say what's going to happen in the future. So we need to indeed learn from the past great masters' stories so that we can gain further wisdom and strength to be a modern Buddhist. Master Yuming also edited and compiled some of the Buddhist teachings and stories within the Tripitaka, the Chinese Tripitaka, and within one of the stories it talked about a story associated to Dighanada. And the story goes that there was once a heretics practitioner. After he gained the 5 miraculous penetrations, he started writing shastras and writing commentaries. And he felt that his wisdom was very sharp, and he didn't want to get refuted. He didn't want to get defeated by other people's refutation or debate. For such reason, he went to the Mahashvara and supplicated him to say that, may I become, please transform me into a certain way so that I will always be victorious with my wisdom. And then Mahashvara bestowed him a city by transforming him into a great rock. And then after becoming a rock, this particular rock can fulfill other people's wishes, as well as answering questions to his followers, so that his followers would be able to debate with the other philosophical philosophers. And then during the time of Dighanada, he used the Buddhist logic, such as hypothesis, reasons, analogy, to debate with this particular heretic school. And the disciples of this particular school couldn't win over Dighanada, and then they went to the rock to make supplication, and the rock would not be able to debate with Dighanada either. After 7 days, there's the weeping and howling and screaming from within the rock. The rock finally got defeated and cracked from within. So that is why Dighanada got quite well known for his ability to debate with others, and he was renowned to have the capacity to make the rock cry and the rock scream. Some of those stories seems to be rather quite mystical and something that's very far-fetched. But when we look at this world nowadays, Elon Musk, for example, invented things that is rather quite strange to our imaginations and strange to our mind. There are the robots that could talk and could do things. So why couldn't a rock do things and reply questions? Within the compilation of Master Yongming's stories, there are lots of those examples of the sentient yet inanimate existence. So I had already shared a few of those examples. When you're reading the book, I don't think you'll get tired of reading, but at the time of translating, I was quite exhausted from translation. But now I had already finished the translation. Let's see if my translation would be able to provide benefits to your views. Now let's look at the view of Samkhyas. We had already looked at the views of Samkhyas. Now let's look at the next category, which is the Vaishesikas. The 6 categories known by Vaishesikas, liberation practice is untrue. The founder of Vaishesika, his name is Kanada, and he would practice during the day, and in the evening he would go out and beg for alms. But it seems that people tend to dislike him and ban him from going inside the cities, or they would not give him any food. So he ran into the valleys and received some and harvested some rice, and then attained realization over there inside the valley. He felt that he had already seen his deity, which was the Mahashvara, and then he started composing the Shastra. This Rishi Kanata, his practice is rather quite strange, because in the non-Buddhist schools or in the heretic practices, there are a variety of rather quite strange practices. At the time of his practice, he would rely on one of the Mahashvaras representing signs, and at the time of practicing, he relied on the sign of the lingam of Mahashvara, and by relying on that, at the time of practice, he invented the 6 categories. Sometimes 6, sometimes 9. The 6 categories including substance, quality, activity, generality, particularity, and inherence. After inventing the 6 categories, an owl landed on the sign that he was practicing upon, and then he asked the owl by saying that, "Do you think my invention is reasonable? Do you think the substance is existent?" And then owls usually would shake their heads, but over here the owls would nod, and then he asked the owl, "Does the substance exist?" And then the owl would nod, and then he continued to ask for each of the categories. The owls nod, and after asking, the owl flew away. And the Rishi Kanata felt that his invention was successful, and ever since then, his teaching started to became one of the most influential teachings within the world. I think it is quite interesting to try to understand the philosophy and the history of the different religions and the foundational studies of the different philosophical thinkings. We had already studied the Vaishesika's school of philosophies in the other teachings. And Longchenpa indeed expounded a bit more in the auto commentary, because Longchenpa is very proficient in understanding of both the Buddhist and non-Buddhist teachings, and his teachings are quite excellent. Within the Tripitaka, I've stated that Master Xuanzang translated debates over the Vaishesika school's opinions and ideas. Also, the other text I mentioned earlier, the Samkhya Karika, that's translated by Paramatta. Whenever you have time, you can read into it. If you can find Vasubandhu's composition over the debates over the Samkhya Karika, then if you can find it, that would be wonderful. That must be quite interesting too. Some of the Chinese masters specifically translated the non-Buddhist school's teachings, including within Master Oyi's commentary. He also made a brief introduction of the Samkhya Karika. So not just the Chinese Buddhism or the Tibetan Buddhism, the Tripitaka and other Shastras, within all of those texts, in fact, there are not only the languages and words of the Buddha and of the great masters, but there are words and teachings that's dabbing into the opinions of the non-Buddhist schools as well. Some of you may think that why are you talking of the philosophies of non-Buddhist schools every day? Why do Longchenpa talk so extensively about the non-Buddhist teachings? And why do Mipa Rinpoche, for example, talk about all of the non-Buddhist philosophies so much during the studies of Madhyamika? In fact, all of those teachings are not to guide us to become non-Buddhist students. Rather, it is for us to delve into the studies so that we would become a Buddhist that would not give up on the three jewels after being influenced by other teachings. On top of that, the Buddhists have rather very open, they're very open-minded, and we do not reject the ideas of the non-Buddhists, nor to slander the non-Buddhist teachings and philosophies. But to yourself, if you were to delve into the non-Buddhist teachings but give up on the Buddhist teachings, what kind of fruition would that bring you? So after getting to know all of the variety of the non-Buddhist schools, it is essential for us to study the Buddhist, because then we would understand how precious and how rare it is to study the Buddhism teachings. We need to be confident with the Buddhist points of view. And in order to do that, we need to have full understanding of both the Buddhist and non-Buddhist teachings so that we can also benefit ourselves and benefit sentient beings. Now we are going to pause the teachings of the wish-fulfilling treasury for a period of time. We had already studied for over 40 classes. We had finished many classes during this year. In a little short while ago, Khenpo Tsotrem Lodro finished teaching lots of classes, and the lamas had praised him. Other than the wish-fulfilling treasury, I also give teachings on the Shurangama Sutra and other sutras. So don't you think I also deserve some applauses? Now we have completely finished the first half of the wish-fulfilling treasury. May the three jewels and three roots and the protectors grant us a blessing so that we can finish studying this full text within this lifetime. This is our aspiration and this is our supplication.